and welcome grade 11th. In our today's session, we'll be looking at a short story titled Scared. Now on our short story, we'll be highlighting the following points: the summary, the title, the themes, the setting, plot, characters, and characterization. Now, on the summary of the story, we see a character by the name of Gary Wilson. Gary Wilson is a rude, aggressive, and selfish teenager from London. He bullies children at school and disrespects his mother. His mother takes him to visit his grandmother in a village in Suffolk for a week. He hates being there. He is bored. One day he decides to go for a walk. In his walk, he breaks all the rules that he's supposed to follow. He walks through the fields instead of sticking to the footpath. He picks wildflowers and tears them up. He leaves gates open, hoping that the farmer's animals will run away. He throws his Coke can into a field. He breaks the branch of an apple tree, and he leaves his lit cigarette butt in the grass, which could cause a fire. Gary gets lost, and bad things start to happen to him. His feet get wet. He sprains his ankle. When he turns around, the landscape has changed and he could not find his way home. In a small forest, he scratches his shoulder and cuts his leg. He tears his jacket. He falls into a stream. He gets stung by nettles and by a wasp. It seems as if nature is attacking him as revenge for his terrible treatment of it. Eventually, he sees his grandmother's house. He gets halfway across the field. He feels hot and tired. He decides to rest and holds onto a pole in the middle of the field. He magically turns into a scarecrow. When he does not come home that evening, his mother calls the police. They searched for him for 5 days. None of them realize that he is the scarecrow in the field next to his grandmother's cottage. His mother decides to go back to London. As she leaves, she notices the scarecrows in the field. She realizes that it looks like Gary. However, she decides not to look at it more closely. We realize that she is relieved not to have Gary in her life anymore. And now moving on to the title of the story. On the title of the story, we'll be looking at whether the title is suitable to the story or not. When Gary realizes that he's lost, he starts to feel a little bit scared. Well, the narrator says he was also beginning to feel the first strings of something. He was not actually scared. He was too angry for that. He was beginning to wonder just how much further he would have to walk before he knew where he was, and how much further could he walk. Even though Gary does not admit that he's scared, we realize that he is starting to feel that way. Gary is not used to feeling scared. Usually he's the one who makes other people feel scared. He actually enjoyed hurting other kids. but scaring them was just as much fun. His mother is scared of him. He was as tall as she was now, and he knew that in her own quiet way she was scared of him too. At the end of the story, Gary is turned into a scarecrow. The job of a scarecrow is to scare away the birds. It is funny and satisfying for the reader that now Gary scares things in order to protect nature. And now we can say the title is suitable for the story because it directly speaks of the fear that people had over Gary. Nobody wanted to associate with him. His family feared him to the extent that they would at times bribe him with CDs. The crows ran away, scared by his lonely figure in the middle of the field. So we can say the title, Scared, is suitable for the story. And now we'll be moving on to the themes of the story. And on our story we have so many themes, and the first theme we'll be looking at is isolation. Gary lived a life in isolation as other learners avoided him. We also learned that many of the learners did not want to be associated with Gary. Gary's behavior made him a loner wherever he is, and he was quite comfortable about that. And the next theme we'll be moving on to is bullying. Gary was a qualified bully. Gary enjoyed hurting other kids, taking their lunch money, or ripping pages out of their books. He derived pleasure in seeing other kids being persecuted. And the other thing that we'll be looking at is bribery. Gary's mother would give him CDs as a way of bribing him. When he has done something wrong and the mother wants to soothe his emotions, CDs will be given to him. And the other theme that we'll be looking at is selfishness. Gary enjoyed being in control. No other person may ever laugh at him, but he will enjoy hurting other kids. And another theme that we'll be looking at is struggle. During a walk, he gets lost and finds it difficult to locate where the house is. All the things that Gary had thrown on the way during a walk were not there to assist him with tracing the grandmother's place. Gary ends up being like a scarecrow in the middle of the fields when he could not continue with his walk towards his grandmother's house. And another thing that we'll be looking at is hate. Gary's peers never wanted to associate with him. We start seeing no person wanted to be with him or be associated with him. People actually hated Gary. And the next point that we'll be looking at is respect for nature. Respect for nature. Nature has in it all the things we need to survive: food, water, sunlight, etc. However, when we do not show respect for nature, we can destroy it. This will affect us negatively in the long run. We have destroyed a lot of nature already through littering, building cities, and running factories that release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This theme is evident in the story when Gary's grandmother expresses the idea that nature is good for us. She notices that Gary's mother does not look well. She often talks about the peace and fresh air in the country. She also reminds Gary to remember the country code. This is the set of rules in England that tell people how to treat nature respectfully. However, Gary does not care about this. He thinks it is nonsense. He does everything he can to destroy and disrespect nature. In real life, nature could not take revenge. But in this story, however, Horowitz imagines what it would be like if nature had magical powers and could take revenge on people who treat it badly. And the next theme that we'll be moving on is justice. This is the idea that things need to be fair. If someone does something bad, they need to be punished according to what they did wrong. And this theme is evident in the text when Gary treats everyone badly: his classmates, his mother, and his grandmother. He is mean, selfish, and violent. No one is able to control him. Therefore, the reader is satisfied at the end of the story when Gary is punished by nature. He cannot hurt anyone anymore because he is a scarecrow and he cannot move. Not only is Gary punished, but he is punished in a way that feels like the right kind of punishment. He hates nature, and now he is forced to spend the rest of his life in nature. This is called poetic justice because the punishment is so right, it feels like poetry. And we'll be moving on to our next point, which is the setting of the story. The story is set in the countryside in Suffolk. Excuse me. Countryside in Suffolk, England. Which is not far from London. In the countryside, there are forests of trees, vast landscapes, and many hills. It is set in the current day. Now we'll be moving on to the plot of the story. And the first point that we'll be looking at is the exposition. The story presents a very troublesome character, Gary, who is a natural bully towards both his peers and his mother. It is this Gary whom no one wants to associate with under any circumstances. And our next point is the rising action. The rising action starts when Gary travels with his mother from London to Pile Hall. to visit his grandmother. It is a 2-hour journey from where they stay to the grandmother's place. Gary does not like the place like London. And now moving on to our next point, we'll be looking at the climax. The climax is when the problem or the conflict reaches its peak. During Gary's walk, he experiences a few setbacks, losing his track of the path, injuring his ankle, stepping into a swamp of water with shoes, and being bitten by an insect. He was exhausted and unable to continue walking home. And moving on to the falling action. The falling action is when the problem gets to a point where it comes down, where a solution starts to be realized. When Gary had walked, he came to a point where he could not locate his way back home and ended up being stuck on a pole like a scarecrow. And the resolution. The resolution is when the conflict is then resolved, and that's where or how the story will be ending. Gary was reported as a missing person to the police. His mother left the place in a taxi. Despite the mother seeing something like Gary, she did not bother to stop the taxi and verify if it was indeed her son. This left the mother with freedom as Gary always bullied her. And now we'll be moving on to the characters and characterization. And the first character that we'll be looking at is Gary Wilson. Gary Wilson is the only child of Jane Wilson. He is a 15-year-old boy who is too tall for his age. He is a qualified bully who disrespects people and nature. He is not heavily built. He had long arms, hard fists, and knew how to use them. Gary liked to be in control. And he was able to look after himself. No one would ever laugh at him. Everyone avoided him and he was fine with it. Gary enjoyed hating other kids. Gary's mother bribed him with CDs. He got lost while on a walk during a visit to his grandmother. He never got well with his father. Gary tended to be like a scarecrow. He was also reported to the police as a missing person. And the next character that we'll be looking at is Jane Wilson, Gary's mother. Let me just finish it. Jane Wilson. Jane Wilson was a wife to Edward and a mother to Gary. She lived together with her bully son Gary in London. Jane was a widow. She had lost her husband. Jane denies that she is thinner, tired, and has no color, or she is pale. Jane bribes Gary with CDs. She got pension payouts and insurance policies after her husband's death. Jane leaves her mother after Gary had gone missing. She does not bother to look at the figure that looks like the scarecrow, even when she feels like it is her son. She now becomes free from the troubles she used to have at the hands of Gary. And the next character that we'll be looking at is Edward Wilson. Edward Wilson worked as a banker. He one day fell and died suddenly at work after getting a massive heart attack, which might probably be as a result of what Gary did to the young and the old. And the next character that we'll be looking at is Gary's grandmother. Grandmother was mother to Jane. She stayed at Pye Hall. Her assessment of her daughter is not pleasing. She says her daughter was thin, tired, and had a bad skin tone. Despite her age, she still cares about her child's welfare and truly loves nature. And now we'll be moving on to our next point, which is the narrator's point of view. I'll just erase here. And we're done. The narrator's point of view. The story has a third person's narrative voice. This means that the narrator who tells the story is just a voice. He is not a character in the story. Gary does not tell his own story, even though he is the main character. And that will be all for our today's session. Thank you and have a marvelous day.